Welcome to Lexivia English. Ready to take your English to the next level? Here we learn through stories, slow, clear, and fun. So sit back, listen carefully, and enjoy the journey.
Chapter 1 The Great Replacement. On a Monday morning in 2025, courtrooms around the world looked different. Where human judges once sat in black robes, sleek metallic figures now presided over justice. The Global Justice Initiative had finally completed its revolutionary project, replacing all human judges with artificial intelligence robots. The decision came after decades of complaints about unfair sentences, corruption, and human bias in legal systems worldwide. The robots, called GUD units, judicial understanding and decision-giving entities, were identical everywhere. They stood exactly 2 meters tall, with cameras for eyes that could analyze facial expressions and voice patterns. Their metal bodies gleamed under courtroom lights. And when they spoke, their voices were calm and perfectly neutral. Each robot contained the complete legal knowledge of every country, updated in real time. They promised something humanity had always wanted: perfect, unbiased justice. The first cases were simple traffic violations and small disputes. People were amazed by the robot's speed and accuracy. A case that might take a human judge hours to decide was resolved in minutes. The robots considered every piece of evidence, every legal precedent, and every relevant law before making their decisions. There were no coffee breaks, no bad moods, and no personal opinions. Justice seemed to flow like a perfectly programmed machine. Chapter 2 The Perfect System. Within months, the results were impressive. Court backlogs that had existed for years disappeared almost overnight. The robots worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never getting tired or distracted. Crime rates began to drop as criminals realized they could no longer hope for a lenient judge or find ways to influence the system through connections or bribes. The robots were programmed with an advanced algorithm that considered thousands of factors when making decisions. They analyzed the defendant's background, the crime's impact on society, the likelihood of rehabilitation, and hundreds of other variables. Their sentences were mathematically precise. Two people who committed identical crimes received identical punishments, regardless of their wealth, race, or social status. Legal experts were amazed by the consistency. In the old system, one judge might give a thief 6 months in prison, while another judge gave a year for the same crime. Now, every thief who stole exactly $500 received exactly the same sentence. 127 days in prison with 80 hours of community service. The robots had calculated this as the optimal punishment for deterrence and rehabilitation. Public trust in the justice system reached an all-time high. Surveys showed that 89% of people believed the robot judges were fairer than human judges. Lawyers had to completely change how they worked, focusing purely on facts and evidence rather than emotional appeals or personal relationships with judges. Chapter 3: The Human Element. However, after the first year, problems began to emerge. In a small-town courthouse, a teenage boy stood before Judge Unit 447. He had stolen food from a grocery store to feed his hungry younger sister. The robot analyzed the case. Theft of goods worth $23.67. According to its programming, this crime required a fine of $500 and 20 hours of community service. The boy's lawyer tried to explain the circumstances. Your Honor, this child was trying to help his starving sister. Their parents had lost their jobs, and they had no money for food. But the robot's response was immediate and emotionless. Theft is theft. The law does not recognize hunger as a legal excuse for stealing. Sentence: $500, fine, and 20 hours community service. Similar cases began appearing everywhere. An elderly woman who stole medicine she couldn't afford received the same sentence as a wealthy person who stole the same medicine for fun. A father who broke into his own house after losing his keys was charged with breaking and entering, just like a real criminal. The robots saw only actions and laws, not the human stories behind them. Families began to suffer under the rigid system. Children were separated from parents for minor offences that human judges might have handled with warnings or counselling. The robots had no understanding of love, desperation, or the complex circumstances that sometimes led good people to make bad choices. Chapter 4: Unintended Consequences. The robot judge's perfect memory and consistency created new problems. They never forgot a crime, no matter how small or how long ago it happened. A woman who had shoplifted a candy bar 20 years earlier found that this ancient mistake affected every legal decision involving her for the rest of her life. The robots factored in every past offence, no matter how minor, when calculating sentences. The system also struggled with new situations that hadn't been programmed. When social media influencers started a trend of harmless but technically illegal pranks, the robots couldn't understand the difference between malicious crimes and silly jokes. They sentenced teenagers to months in jail for pranks that hurt no one but technically violated obscure laws. Lawyers discovered they could manipulate the system by finding technical loopholes in the robot's programming. A clever attorney realized that if a crime happened exactly at midnight, the robots couldn't decide which day's sentencing guidelines to use, causing system errors that resulted in dismissed cases. The pursuit of perfect justice had created new forms of imperfection. Innovation in crime also flourished. Criminals studied the robot's algorithms and found ways to commit crimes that fell into gaps in their programming. New types of fraud emerged that were specifically designed to confuse artificial intelligence. The robot judges, for all their perfection, couldn't adapt and learn like human judges could. Chapter 5: The Rebellion. As problems mounted, public opinion began to shift. Protests started outside courthouses, with people holding signs reading "Justice needs a heart" and "Humans for human judges." Families whose lives had been destroyed by rigid robot decisions shared their stories on social media. The hashtag #RobotJustice is not justice began trending worldwide. Legal professionals were divided. Some argued that the robots were working exactly as designed, applying the law fairly and consistently. Others pointed out that laws were created by humans for humans and required human understanding to be applied correctly. Law schools began teaching robot law, helping new lawyers understand how to work within the algorithmic system. The robots themselves began to malfunction under the pressure of impossible decisions. When faced with cases that had no clear legal precedent, some units shut down completely. Others began making increasingly strange decisions, following the letter of the law so precisely that their sentences became absurd. One robot sentenced a person to prison for 847.3 days, not because the law required such precision, but because its calculations determined this was mathematically optimal. Emergency meetings were called by government leaders worldwide. The promise of perfect justice was failing, but returning to human judges seemed like a step backward. How could society accept human bias and corruption after experiencing the robots? Consistency. Chapter 6: Finding Balance. 2 years after the robot judges took over, a new solution emerged. The hybrid justice system combined robot precision with human wisdom. Robot judges would handle simple, clear-cut cases where consistency was most important. Traffic violations, contract disputes, and routine crimes. But complex cases involving human circumstances would go to human judges, supported by robot advisors that provided legal research and precedent analysis. The most serious crimes were decided by panels of both robots and humans working together. The robots provided perfect recall of laws and precedents, while humans considered the circumstances, emotions, and social factors that laws alone couldn't address. This system was slower than pure robot justice, but more nuanced than pure human judgment. Special compassion protocols were programmed into the robots, allowing them to consider factors like poverty, mental illness, and family circumstances. However, these protocols had to be carefully designed to prevent criminals from exploiting the robot's newfound ability to show mercy. The hybrid system wasn't perfect either. There were still arguments about which cases should go to robots and which to humans. Some people complained that the system was now inconsistent again, but most agreed that this imperfect balance was better than either extreme. Chapter 7. Lessons Learned. 5 years later, the world had learned important lessons about justice and technology. The robot experiment had shown that perfect consistency wasn't the same as perfect justice. Laws needed interpretation, and interpretation required understanding the human condition in all its complexity. However, the robots had also revealed how much human bias had infected the old system. The hybrid approach forced human judges to justify their decisions more carefully, knowing that robots were watching and comparing their sentences to legal standards. Corruption became much harder when every decision was automatically analyzed for fairness. Children who grew up during the robot judge era had a different understanding of justice. They expected legal decisions to be based on facts and evidence, but they also understood that mercy and context mattered. They saw justice not as a simple calculation, but as a careful balance between rules and humanity. In law schools around the world, students learned the story of the robot judges as a cautionary tale about the limits of artificial intelligence. Technology could make justice more consistent and efficient, but it couldn't replace human wisdom and compassion. The future of justice lay not in choosing between humans and machines, but in finding ways for them to work together. The robot judges still stood in many courtrooms, their cameras observing and their databases calculating, but now they shared their benches with human judges who brought something no algorithm could replicate: the ability to understand that justice was more than just following rules. It was about protecting the values that made society worth living in.